Okay, we're going to start a brand new chapter and really a brand new section in fluid mechanics. We're moving away from the Reynolds transport theorem, which we have been working with in the last couple of chapters, last few chapters, in fact, and we're going to start a new discussion of dimensional analysis and similitude. And so basically, our roadmap shows that because of the complexity of flows, designs are often based, that is, engineering designs are often based on experimental results, which are commonly done using scale models. That is, we can use, say, something small in a test tank of water, a fluid, or perhaps in a wind tunnel to simulate conditions that occur in the real world at larger scales. The theoretical basis of the experimental testing is called dimensional analysis, and that's the topic of this chapter. And this topic is also used to simplify analysis and to present results. And so what this particular lecture is going to do is focus in on the first two sections. Section 8.2 is so short that I decided to include it in with 8.1. So we're just going to give a brief description of what dimensional analysis is and why it's needed, and then explain, basically just state the Buckingham pi theorem, and then we will use, in a subsequent video, we will use that theorem to determine what are called pi groups. So let's get going. Experimentation is needed in fluid mechanics because even though we've been using these as if they were perfect equations, the momentum and energy equations are actually not accurate. And this is because of fluid mechanics is so complicated that we end up getting very turbulent conditions, and it's very hard to track the actual properties of momentum and energy within a fluid. And also, if we had a really good computer model, say a computational fluid dynamics model, what we call CFD, if we had a really good computer and we could simulate these things very well, perhaps we could rely on that as well. But the current models and the current computers used to do these are only provide approximate solutions for turbulent flow. So we really don't have a great way of dealing with things that are really highly turbulent. It's just too difficult to track this sort of stuff. Therefore, we use something called dimensionless groups. And that's because and we do that when it's unfeasible to make a full-scale prototype to start out with, and we would use a scale model. So the book describes this situation. This is probably not a good example of when we couldn't use a full-scale model, because we could build something like this pretty easily. But this is a flow through what's called an inverted nozzle. And the flow conditions for flow going from left to right, and we can see these lines are depicting turbulence here. The flow in an inverted nozzle like this is going to be very, very different than if the flow is from right to left, which is the normal situation. So this flow of going left to right might be a situation where we have some backflow. Maybe the flow is typically from right to left, but in the case maybe when the part is malfunctioning or the flow is malfunctioning, we get some backflow. And so this is kind of a weird situation where we might want to understand what the flow conditions are going to be. So we, as engineers, we like to do experiments. So we go into the lab and maybe we would do some experimentation where we try for several different nozzle diameters. If we look back, here's the D0. We would choose several different nozzle diameters, and we would subject our experiment to several different velocities and measure the pressure difference between points P1 and P2. And if we look back here, that would be a point here and say a point here inside the nozzle. And so this would be all good and well, and we could see from our experiment that we would get these relationships, three different relationships. But it turns out that in reality, experimentation in the laboratory can be quite expensive, especially if you're using a wind tunnel or perhaps a large what is called a flume, which simulates large realistic fluid flow. And so each one of these points could be quite expensive to actually generate, depending on the complexity of the experiment. And so what we do is we rely on dimensional analysis, which can provide more detail in far fewer experiments. So this is the key here. And so what we have done and what we will figure out how to do is we have rewritten the problem in terms of some dimensionless numbers. And what we have decided to do in terms of a second experiment here is we have decided to, instead of using the diameter of the nozzle, the inverted nozzle, we're now using a pi group, which is a dimensionless number, which is the ratio of diameters of the two diameters. This is the larger diameter and then the inverted nozzle diameter. So that's a new variable and it's dimensionless. We're doing experiments now and plotting data against this dimensionless variable, which is the pressure difference, or pressure forces, if you will, over the velocity here, or actually the velocity squared times the density, which is also going to be in pressure. This is kind of a velocity pressure. So this is, again, a non-dimensional number. The dimensions of these cancel out. And so we can, in one case, one of these points, we can set these conditions of the velocity, and we are going to get a certain pressure difference out of that. And so we have basically, and then we can do that for different sets of these dimensionless numbers, both the diameter ratio and this ratio of the pressure to kind of the kinetic pressure. So we reduce the number of experiments. If we go back, we reduce the number of experiments from 9 in this case down to 3 in this case. And so we've reduced it by a factor of 3. So dimensionless groups, such as these numbers right here, are determined by dimensional analysis. So it's important for us to understand what we mean by that. These groups provide a link between models and prototypes. That is, a model might be a full-scale model of a plane, whereas a prototype might be a scaled version. And then we have to link these models and prototypes through fluid mechanical theory. So why is this relevant to fluid mechanics? In the real world, we need to deal with real problems. We can't necessarily idealize things like turbulence. It's just too complicated. Also, in many, many cases in fluids, we do not get what are called analytical solutions, where we can solve the equations uniquely. The equations are just too difficult when we have turbulent flow and fluid flow. So the systems of equations can't always be solved in a nice, convenient way. Say that, like what we learned in differential equations or in linear algebra, we can't really analytically solve these. Therefore, engineers rely on experimentation, laboratory work, and scaled models and prototypes to move forward. So before we proceed, let's remind ourselves what dimensional homogeneity is. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples here quickly. So if we look at an energy equation, I'm just writing down a couple of terms here which are different forms of energy. This equation may or may not represent anything, but I'm just writing down these different terms of energy. We know that this is a force times a distance, this is a kinetic energy, and this is potential energy. And we can see that if we write down the units of this is kilograms meter over second squared times a meter. That's going to equal meters squared over seconds squared times a kilogram. I guess I could have put that the other way around. And then this is plus a kilogram meter over second squared times a meter. So we can see in all cases the units are the same. The units in all cases are kilogram meter squared over second squared. So these are units of energy in all cases. A second example of this is, get a new page here, is just a Bernoulli equation. If we look at this, we have v squared over 2g, that's a 1, plus z1 equals p2 over gamma plus v2 squared over 2g plus z2. Now we know that these are going to have units of meters, the elevations, but we can also see quite quickly that that pressure is given in Newton per meter squared, and gamma is in Newton over a meter cubed, and the velocity is again meters squared over seconds squared, and the g, 2 is dimensionless of course, and g is in meters squared per second. And so out of this we're going to get 1 meter. 1 over meters is just a meter, and in this case meter, I'm sorry, this should be a meter per second squared. So that, I'm sure you noticed that. So 1 over second squared, 1 over second squared, and we're left with a meter up here. And that's going to be the true for both of these. So in this case, just to write this out, we get meters plus meters plus meters equals meters plus meters plus meters. And this equation is all dimensionally homogeneous in that all the terms, no matter how they're combined, give us meters. So before we proceed with doing dimensional analysis and determining what are called pi groups, we need to remind ourselves of what the 6 fundamental units are in the SI system. The 6 fundamental units, this is a remarkable fact, that there are 6 fundamental units from which all other units can be derived. And those are, or dimensions I guess we would call them instead of units, length, time, mass, and then a couple of others that are important. Sometimes in fluids, temperature is important. Temperature is a fundamental unit, as you might expect, as is electrical current, which we don't usually use in fluids, haven't used it at all, and then also a variable called luminance. And so the next question is, which of these are important for fluid mechanics? And we note that these 3 are the primary ones that are used for fluid mechanics, and in some cases I suspect that maybe temperature is. But for our case, we're largely going to be interested in length, times, and mass. And so that's it for our introduction to why dimensional analysis is important, the need for it. And so now let's just state the Buckingham pi theorem, and that'll be it for these 2 sections, and we'll record a separate video in how to actually use dimensional analysis to find pi groups. So the Buckingham pi theorem says, and we'll figure out why this is important later, but the number of independent dimensional groups, which we call pi groups of variables, these dimensionless parameters that we saw before, needed to correlate the variables in a given process or problem is equal to n minus m, where n is the number of variables involved and m is the number of basic dimensions included in the variables. And in fact, I should go back and say that what I really meant here were dimensions and not units, because they are different. Okay. And the final slide here says, so if an equation describing a physical process or physical system has n-dimensional variables, as expressed here, where we have y1, 2, 3, all the way up to n. This is n number of variables. It can be rearranged and expressed in terms of n minus m pi groups. So the pi groups, the dimensionless, these are going to become dimensionless numbers. And we are going to have n minus n of those. So if we have n variables and we're able to identify m dimensions that are important in those variables, m dimensions, we will eventually have n minus m pi groups. Okay, and that's we'll see that in the next section as we apply these. Okay, thanks.